My name is Katherine. I am 48 years old, and for the last 2 decades, I've made my living as a senior financial risk analyst. My job is to spot the invisible hairline fractures in billion-dollar corporate portfolios long before the glass actually shatters. I do not panic. I calculate. When my 20-year-old daughter came to me, her hands trembling so violently that her father's iPad nearly slipped from her grip, the tears streaming down her face told a story I had already meticulously decoded. She sobbed, struggling to push the words past her lips, confessing that her father had harbored another family for the past 11 years. I didn't gasp. I didn't drop my porcelain mug. I simply took a slow, deliberate sip of my dark roast coffee, letting the bitter warmth ground me, and reached into my structured leather tote. From its depths, I extracted a 400-page dossier, a masterwork 3 years in the making. It was a suffocating web of financial audits, asset freezes, and comprehensive legal forfeiture paperwork that was about to obliterate my husband's entire existence. "I know, sweetheart," I said, my voice steady, an anchor in her storm. "And we are exactly 10 minutes away from ending that man's life as he knows it. Before I show you exactly how I systematically dismantled the empire of a textbook sociopath without shedding a single tear, subscribe to the channel. This isn't just a story of infidelity. It's a blueprint for taking your power back and letting the system do the execution. It is fascinating how the most profound betrayals are so often masked by the scent of freshly cut grass and the quiet hum of luxury SUVs. We lived in one of Connecticut's most aggressively affluent suburbs, a place where manicured lawns served as the front lines for quiet, neighborly warfare. Being a Black woman navigating the upper echelons of corporate risk analysis had already taught me everything I needed to know about the breathtaking arrogance of mediocre men. But my husband, Richard, was not mediocre in his success. At 50, he was a formidable regional director, a man who wore his corporate authority like his tailored Tom Ford suits, impeccably fitted and deliberately designed to intimidate. His arrogance, however, was entirely pedestrian. To the outside world, Richard was the paradigm of the modern American patriarch. He was the jovial coach dad on weekends, the civic leader who smiled with just the right amount of teeth at the country club galas. He genuinely believed he was a maestro, conducting a grand symphony of deceit, managing 2 completely separate lives with the flawless precision of a Swiss watch. Monday through Wednesday, he played the devoted husband and father in our sprawling, 6-bedroom colonial. Thursday through Saturday, he was purportedly dominating regional boardrooms across the East Coast. In reality, he was tending to his secondary, secret existence. He operated with the suffocating privilege of a man who had never been told no and never expected to be caught. I remember the exact sensory details of his Thursday morning departures. He would lean down, pressing a customary, hollow kiss to my forehead. He always smelled faintly of an overpriced hotel soap, a generic, citrusy scent he specifically purchased just to maintain the corporate illusion. His leather briefcase would snap shut with a sharp, satisfying click, a sound that, I later realized, signaled the start of his weekend shift in another woman's bed. He assumed that I, his dutiful and fiercely driven wife, was too wrapped up in the relentless demands of my own career to look closely at the margins of our life together. But risk analysts live entirely in the margins. The unraveling did not begin with a stray blonde hair on a lapel or a waft of cheap perfume. It started with a microscopic, almost invisible anomaly. It was a chilly November evening. I was sitting alone at the sprawling quartz island in our kitchen, the only sound in the house being the soft, rhythmic hum of the Sub-Zero refrigerator. I was casually reviewing the monthly ledger of a secondary joint bank account we kept primarily for emergency property maintenance. There it was, a solitary, innocuous charge. A $43.50 transaction at an independent gas station located 2 hours north of the city, time-stamped at 11:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. Richard's shared digital calendar, a vibrant, meticulously curated masterpiece of color-coded lies, dictated that he was in the middle of a high-stakes quarterly review in downtown Manhattan at that precise moment. Manhattan executives do not buy $40 worth of mid-grade unleaded at a rural rest stop in the middle of a board meeting. I didn't call him. I didn't send a frantic, emotionally charged text message demanding an explanation. Confrontation is the desperate refuge of the unprepared. Instead, I let the silence settle over me like a heavy, protective cloak. I simply made a mental note, filing the discrepancy away in the cold, logical vault of my mind. Over the following weeks, I transformed into a silent auditor of my own marriage. I watched him. I observed the microscopic tightening of his jaw when his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, the subtle, defensive shift in his posture when our youngest daughter asked innocent questions about his work trips. He was so deeply entrenched in his own narcissism, so thoroughly insulated by his ego, that he mistook my quiet observation for blind trust. He genuinely believed his mask was impenetrable. He looked at me and saw a safe, reliable anchor, completely forgetting that anchors are fundamentally designed to drag things to the bottom of the ocean. I began pulling threads. In the dead of night, while he snored softly beside me, I traced his corporate expense accounts, cross-referencing them against his digital geographical footprint. At first, the findings were agonizingly cliché. The burner phones registered under a Shell LLC, the concealed credit lines, the meticulously curated alibis built on the backs of complicit colleagues who covered for him. Everything looked like a typical man's midlife crisis, a predictable and pathetic descent into suburban infidelity. Until that damp, dreary afternoon when he carelessly forgot to lock the bottom drawer of his heavy mahogany study desk. Until I slipped my hand beneath a pristine stack of old tax returns and my fingers brushed against the thick, coarse texture of a watermarked state document. Everything looked like a typical midlife crisis. Until I unfolded that paper and found a certified death certificate with my name on it. The paper was heavy, a premium 32-pound linen stock that felt entirely too luxurious for a forged government document. I sat perfectly still in the ambient glow of the banker's lamp on Richard's desk, my thumb tracing the raised, embossed seal of the state of Rhode Island. There is a profound, out-of-body surrealism in reading the clinical details of your own demise. According to the neatly typewritten ink, I had succumbed to an aggressive, unspecified neurological illness 5 years prior. My age, my maiden name, my social security number, all meticulously accurate, culminating in a fabricated date of death. I did not weep. I did not hurl the heavy crystal whiskey decanter across the room, nor did I collapse onto the Persian rug in a puddle of betrayed agony. Instead, my training kicked in. When a risk analyst encounters a catastrophic structural failure, emotion is a liability. Data is the only currency that matters. If Richard had gone to the extraordinary, felonious lengths of procuring a counterfeit death certificate, he was not merely hiding a mistress. He was architecting a parallel universe. I pushed deeper into the drawer. Beneath the false bottom, sliding away with a quiet scrape against the mahogany, lay the architecture of his second life. It was organized with the same neurotic precision he applied to his corporate quarterly reports. I pulled out a thick manila envelope. Inside was a warranty deed for a 4-bedroom colonial in Providence, Rhode Island, exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes northeast of our driveway. The property was jointly held by Richard and a woman named Madeline M. Behind the deed were the pediatric dental bills, orthodontic consultations, a glossy brochure for a prestigious private boys' academy. I stared at a school portrait that slipped out from between the receipts. A boy, roughly 10 years old, with Richard's distinct, sloping jawline and the same arrogant spark in his dark eyes. His name was Ethan. The mathematics of the betrayal assembled themselves in my mind like a spreadsheet, snapping into place. 10 years old. That meant this secondary existence had been running concurrently with our own for over a decade. While I was sitting in sterile waiting rooms, holding Richard's hand during his fabricated anxiety episodes, he was actively curating a second family. To them, he was the tragic, resilient widower who had bravely pieced his life back together after the devastating loss of his first wife. It was a masterclass in sociopathic manipulation. He used my death to extract sympathy, to excuse any lingering emotional distance, and to ensure Madeline never asked to meet his non-existent extended family. But the true depth of his depravity was not revealed in the mortgage statements or the counterfeit government forms. It was buried in a printed email thread, shoved haphazardly toward the back of the drawer. The emails were between Richard and our eldest daughter, Sarah, who was 21 at the time. My eyes scanned the brutal, black-and-white text. Sarah had apparently driven up to Providence for a weekend getaway with her college friends and spotted her father at a local farmer's market, pushing a 10-year-old boy on a bicycle, a strange woman leaning her head on his shoulder. I read my daughter's panicked, heartbroken words. "Dad, who are they? I can't keep lying to Mom. I'm going to throw up every time I look at her." And then I read Richard's response. It was not an apology. It was a tactical strike. "Sarah, you will not breathe a word of this to your mother. She is fragile, and the shock would destroy her. If you selfishly blow this family apart, I will cut you off completely. The law school tuition vanishes. Your trust fund is void. The collapse of this family will be entirely on your hands, and you will carry that guilt forever. Grow up and keep your mouth shut." He had weaponized a child's love against her. He had forced our 21-year-old daughter to carry the suffocating, radioactive weight of his sins for 3 entire years, trapping her in a psychological prison built entirely of his own narcissism. He had traded her mental health for his convenience. Sitting in that quiet, suffocating study, the air suddenly felt incredibly thin. The faint scent of his citrus hotel soap still lingered on the leather chair. A lesser woman might have confronted him the moment he walked through the door. A lesser woman might have packed a bag, hired a loud, aggressive divorce attorney, and settled for half of the visible assets, walking away as a certified victim. But I do not do victimhood. I am an auditor. And Richard had just handed me the master ledger of his vulnerabilities. I carefully placed the death certificate, the deed, and the printed emails back into the drawer, aligning them to the exact millimeter they had occupied before. I closed the false bottom. I locked the drawer. I turned off the banker's lamp. He had declared me dead. That was the exact night I began designing how I would bury him in the very grave he dug for me. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. That implies a singular, dramatic meal. I prefer to think of it as a slow, systematic poisoning of the soil from which my husband drew his lifeblood. The morning after my discovery in his study, I woke up at exactly 5:15 a.m., the way I always did. I slipped out from beneath the high-thread count duvet, padded barefoot into the ensuite bathroom, and splashed cold water on my face. I looked into the mirror. The woman staring back at me was not a grieving widow, nor was she a hysterical, discarded wife. She was a professional architect of ruin, evaluating the structural integrity of the demolition site. When Richard stumbled into the kitchen an hour later, sleep-tousled and exuding that infuriating aura of untouchable comfort, I poured him a cup of coffee. I slid the ceramic mug across the granite counter and offered him a polite, perfectly modulated smile. I watched him take a sip, entirely unaware that the woman standing across from him was actively calculating the precise legal leverage required to strip him of every asset he mistakenly believed was his. If you are watching this and you've ever had to work twice as hard just to get half the respect, hit that subscribe button. Because this story is about what happens when you stop being polite and start keeping receipts. Stay with me. For the next 3 years, I staged a flawless performance. I inhabited the role of the distracted, career-driven wife with chilling perfection. Every Thursday evening, when he performed his little ritual of rubbing his temples and feigning exhaustion at the prospect of another brutal regional summit, I would nod sympathetically. I would pack his overpriced, monogrammed toiletry bag, ensuring his favorite shaving cream was safely tucked inside, essentially helping him pack for his weekends with his fabricated family. But beneath that placid surface, the silent audit was in full, devastating effect. I did not hire a private investigator. Private investigators leave paper trails, and they lack the forensic financial expertise required for the kind of surgical strike I was planning. I used my own credentials. I utilized my access to high-level databases, masking my inquiries beneath routine corporate risk assessments. I traced the serpentine path of his finances. Richard, in his boundless arrogance, believed he was clever by funneling his corporate bonuses through a shell corporation registered in Delaware before trickling the funds into the Providence accounts. It was a laughably amateurish attempt at money laundering. I documented every transfer, every offshore diversion, every single dollar he siphoned away from our legitimate marital assets to support his fantasy life. I didn't stop at the money. I needed to control the narrative, and more importantly, I needed to secure the future he had so casually threatened to destroy. I began quietly liquidating non-essential shared assets, a minor stock portfolio here, a poorly performing mutual fund there, always citing market volatility and portfolio restructuring during our brief, superficial financial check-ins. I moved those funds into secure, irrevocable trusts for our 2 daughters. I ensured that the trusts were ironclad, structured so defensively that even a legion of corporate lawyers couldn't pierce the veil. Richard signed the restructuring documents without reading past the executive summary, too eager to return to his double life to bother with the tedious details of wealth management. He trusted my expertise blindly, which was his fatal flaw. The masterpiece, however, was the corporate leverage. Richard was a regional director, but his compensation was heavily tied to performance shares and a lucrative, vesting pension plan. I spent 6 months meticulously drafting a legal argument, grounded in fiduciary breach and marital fraud statutes, that would essentially allow me to slap a legally binding freeze on his entire corporate compensation package the very second I filed for divorce. I wasn't just going to take half. I was going to sever his financial arteries and watch the empire bleed out. The silence of those 3 years was a heavy, suffocating pressure, like the atmospheric density right before a massive storm breaks. I sat across from him at Thanksgiving dinners, listening to him carve the turkey and pontificate about the value of family loyalty. I watched him interact with our youngest daughter, knowing he was mentally dividing his paternal affection. The hypocrisy was a bitter, metallic taste in the back of my throat, but I swallowed it down. Every time I felt a flicker of genuine rage, I channeled it into the meticulous formatting of the 400-page dossier that was slowly growing in a heavily encrypted file on my secure server. I was not plotting a messy, emotional confrontation. I was drafting a corporate takeover. By the end of the 3rd year, the dossier was complete. It was a terrifying, beautiful document, a weapon of mass financial destruction, legally sound, mathematically irrefutable, and emotionally devoid. Everything was prepared. The trap was fully constructed, the bait was set, and the legal tripwires were drawn taut. The only thing missing was the stage. I needed a setting where the isolation was absolute, a place where his arrogance would be at its peak, and where he would have absolutely nowhere to run when the walls finally collapsed inward. And our upcoming 25th wedding anniversary trip to a secluded, wildly expensive beach house in the Hamptons is going to be the perfect prison. The drive out to the easternmost edge of Long Island requires a specific kind of endurance, a gradual shedding of the mainland's frantic energy as the highway narrows and the Atlantic opens up before you. For our 25th anniversary, I had meticulously selected a modernist, glass and weathered cedar compound in Amagansett. It sat entirely isolated on a private stretch of dunes, at the end of a winding, unmarked gravel road that felt miles away from civilization. There was a very deliberate, tactical reason for this choice. It was geographically isolated. There were no quick train routes back to the city, no easy highway exits to facilitate a sudden, mysterious work emergency. Once we unpacked the car, Richard was physically pinned down. The stage was set, the doors were locked, and there was nowhere for him to run. As he killed the engine of the Range Rover, Richard stepped out onto the crushed shell driveway and took a deep, theatrical breath of the briny sea air. He stretched his arms wide, looking out at the rolling gray waves with the profound, unearned satisfaction of a man who believed he was the architect of a perfect universe. He turned to me, his smile perfectly symmetrical, completely devoid of any genuine warmth, and patted the hood of the car. He looked like a man who had successfully conquered the world. I looked at him and saw a man standing on a trapdoor. Our daughters arrived in a separate car 2 hours later. Maya, my 20-year-old, bounded up the wooden steps with the careless, vibrant energy of a college student ready for a luxurious weekend. But my eyes immediately locked onto Sarah. At 24, she carried a physical heaviness that broke my heart every time I looked at her. She gripped the handle of her canvas weekender bag so tightly her knuckles were translucent. Her eyes darted toward Richard, then quickly snapped down to the decking. She was suffocating under the weight of the secret he had chained to her ankles 3 years ago. I wanted to pull her aside, smooth the tension from her forehead, and whisper that it was almost over. I wanted to tell her that the monster under her bed was about to be evicted. But timing is the most critical component of any controlled demolition. So, I merely kissed her cheek and told her to claim the bedroom with the ocean view. Over the next 48 hours, I observed Richard's hubris with a clinical, almost academic fascination. He was entirely relaxed, operating with a level of complacency that bordered on the grotesque. He would sit on the expansive mahogany deck in his linen trousers, casually swirling a glass of 18-year-old Macallan, completely oblivious to the legal guillotine hovering mere inches above his neck. I watched his micro-movements. I noted the way he would casually angle his phone screen away from the rest of us when a text message vibrated against the teak outdoor table. I saw the calculated, faux casual strolls he took down to the shoreline just to make a quick check-in call to the regional managers, which I knew, with absolute empirical certainty, was his scheduled evening call to Madeline and young Ethan in Providence. He was so profoundly arrogant. He genuinely believed that because he had successfully maintained the lie for a decade, the lie had become the truth. He looked at me, lounging in an Adirondack chair with a novel resting on my lap, and saw only a passive, supportive wife enjoying the fruits of his corporate labor. He had no conception of the 400-page dossier currently sitting in my structured leather tote bag just a few feet away in the foyer. The contrast between his relaxed, sun-drenched posture and the absolute financial annihilation I had prepared for him sent a cold, sharp thrill down my spine. It was a dark, private ecstasy. The culmination of his arrogance arrived on the evening of our actual anniversary. I had arranged for a private chef to prepare a 5-course dinner right there at the house, ensuring our isolation remained unbroken. The dining table was set with heavy silver and stark white linens, positioned perfectly before the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the darkening ocean. Richard was in his element. He poured the vintage Bordeaux with practiced elegance, dominating the space with his deep, resonant voice. He regaled the girls with polished, sanitized anecdotes from his early career, sucking the oxygen out of the room exactly as he always did. Sarah barely touched her sea base, her eyes fixed on the rim of her water glass. Maya laughed at his jokes, innocent and blind to the underlying rot. And then, as the dessert plates were being cleared, Richard picked up his crystal wine glass. He tapped it lightly with a silver spoon, a sharp, clear ringing sound that cut through the low roar of the Atlantic tide outside. He stood up, smoothing the front of his tailored shirt, and looked down at me with an expression of manufactured, hollow adoration. He smiled, raising his glass to the ambient light. To Katherine, he announced, his voice dripping with absolute, unbothered confidence. To 25 years of partnership, and to opening a beautiful, brand new chapter together. I kept my hands resting lightly in my lap, feeling the cool silk of my dress beneath my fingertips. I met his gaze, allowing the corners of my mouth to lift into a smile that did not reach my eyes. He was smiling as he raised his glass to a new chapter. It was a beautiful sentiment. It would also be his last meal as a free, wealthy man. The clinking of heavy silver against fine china had masked the sound of my younger daughter's footsteps. Richard was just lowering his wine glass, the rich burgundy liquid leaving a faint crescent stain on the crystal, when the ambient temperature in the dining room seemed to plummet. I did not need to turn my head to know that the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. The silence that fell over the table was sudden and absolute, heavy with an electric, sickening tension. I looked past Richard's shoulder. Maya stood in the arched doorway of the dining room. All the vibrant, youthful energy she had carried onto the property just 2 days prior had completely drained from her posture. She looked as though she had been struck by lightning. In her trembling hands, she held Richard's sleek, silver iPad Pro. In his supreme arrogance, Richard had left the device charging on the kitchen island, completely unlocked, trusting his manufactured luck. A notification banner must have illuminated the screen. A text message. A photo. Something undeniable. "Dad," Maya whispered. Her voice was thin, reedy, barely pushing past the lump in her throat. She took a hesitant step forward, the iPad shaking so violently, I thought, she might drop it onto the wide-plank hardwood floors. "Dad, who is Ethan? Why is there a picture of you? Why is this woman calling you her husband?" The reaction at the table was instantaneous and profoundly chaotic, playing out in agonizing slow motion. Sarah, my eldest, let out a sharp, choked gasp. Her water glass tipped over, spilling a steady, silent stream of ice water across the pristine white linen tablecloth. She didn't try to stop it. She simply buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving as 3 years of suffocating, coerced silence finally shattered. The guilt, the agonizing burden her father had strapped to her chest, was breaking her in real time. I watched Richard. This was the moment, the exact millisecond the facade collapsed. Most men, caught in a lie of this astronomical magnitude, would panic. They would stammer. They would leap from their chairs. They would invent a desperate, transparent excuse. But Richard was a sociopath accustomed to boardroom dominance. He processed the breach of security, calculated the damage, and immediately shifted into crisis management mode. He let out a long, heavy sigh, pinching the bridge of his nose exactly the way he did when a subordinate missed a quarterly projection. He didn't look at me. He looked directly at Maya, his expression hardening into a mask of disappointed authority. "Maya, put the iPad down," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm, completely devoid of empathy. "This is not how I wanted this to happen. It is highly complicated, and it involves adult matters that you do not fully understand. I was going to sit you and your mother down at the end of this trip and explain the transition." The transition. He was classifying the detonation of our family as a corporate restructuring. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it was almost poetic. He truly believed he was still the smartest person in the room. He believed he could talk his way out of a burning building while holding the matches. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water. I placed the glass down, ensuring it rested precisely in the center of its coaster. "Sit down, Maya," I said. My voice was low, smooth, and absolute. It was the voice of a senior analyst commanding a room. Maya practically collapsed into the nearest chair, her eyes wide, tears spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. Sarah was openly weeping now, refusing to look at her father. I reached down to the floor beside my chair and lifted my structured leather tote. The heavy, gold-plated zipper slid open with a sharp hiss. The dining room was so silent you could hear the distant, rhythmic crash of the Atlantic Ocean against the shoreline outside. Richard finally looked at me, his brow furrowed in minor irritation. "Katherine, please. Let me handle this. I know this is a shock, but if we just approach this logically." I did not let him finish. From the depths of the bag, I extracted the dossier. It was 400 pages of premium, bright white paper, bound securely in a thick black leather folio. It landed on the table with a dull, heavy thud that made the silverware rattle. I opened the cover. I did not shout. I did not hurl insults. I simply became the auditor. I took the first stack of glossy, high-resolution photographs and slid them across the mahogany table, stopping them precisely an inch from his dinner plate. Madeline, Ethan, the Providence house, the pediatric dental bills. Richard stared at the photos. A tiny, microscopic twitch began in the muscle along his jawline. "I know all about the transition, Richard," I said, leaning back in my chair, resting my hands comfortably in my lap. "I have known about Madeline. I have known about Ethan. And, most importantly, I have known about the Rhode Island state death certificate you forged 5 years ago, declaring me dead to your secondary wife." His head snapped up. For the very first time in 25 years, I saw genuine, unadulterated terror behind his eyes. The corporate mask cracked, revealing the pathetic, cornered animal underneath. I didn't stop. I pulled out the next stack of documents. While you were busy managing your two lives, I continued, my tone as conversational as if I were discussing the weather. I was busy managing our assets. You will find, upon reviewing this binder, that the joint accounts are empty. The mutual funds have been legally liquidated and transferred into irrevocable, airtight trusts for Maya and Sarah. Trusts that you cannot touch, not even with a team of Supreme Court litigators. Katherine, what have you done? He hissed, his voice finally losing its polished edge. He reached for the papers, his hands trembling slightly. I am securing my investments, I replied smoothly. I slid the final, heaviest document across the table. It bore the raised, red seal of a federal judge. And that is a court-approved freeze on your entire corporate compensation package, your pension, and your vested stock options, pending a federal investigation into the marital fraud and fiduciary breach you committed to fund your little Providence getaway. I watched the realization wash over him. I watched his eyes scan the legal jargon, the irrefutable, mathematically perfect proof of his own demise. He was looking at his total financial annihilation. The pristine Hamptons house suddenly felt like exactly what it was, a beautifully decorated cage. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. He forgot to breathe, his mouth opening and closing as he stared at the ruins of his empire scattered among the dessert plates. But what would truly finish him was the one final sentence I hadn't said yet. The silence in the dining room was no longer the comfortable quiet of an affluent vacation. It was the absolute, suffocating vacuum of deep space. Richard stared at the raised federal judge's seal on the forfeiture documents resting beside his dessert spoon. I watched his mind race, the rusted gears of his sociopathic intellect desperately grinding against one another, searching for a loophole, an exit strategy, a manipulative angle. But there is no angle against empirical data. There is no negotiating with a mathematical certainty. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to launch into one final, pathetic attempt at gaslighting, to spin a narrative where he was somehow the victim of my sudden, unprovoked cruelty. But I was not quite finished. The coup de grace is meant to be swift, but it should also be unforgettable. By the way, I murmured. My voice was a soft, melodious hum, barely louder than the rhythmic crashing of the Atlantic tide against the dunes outside. I adjusted the napkin in my lap, smoothing a microscopic wrinkle in the pristine white linen. I had a very illuminating phone conversation this morning before the caterers arrived. Richard's eyes flicked up from the legal documents, his pupils dilating in a primal, animalistic panic. The tiny muscle along his jawline ceased its twitching, freezing entirely. I called Providence, I continued, letting the syllables roll slowly off my tongue. I spoke to Madeline. If the financial forfeiture was a bullet, the mention of her name was the explosive payload. All the remaining color drained from his face, leaving a terrifying, ashen gray in its wake. His shoulders, previously squared with absolute corporate authority, slumped inward as if his spine had suddenly liquefied. I simply introduced myself. I said, my tone as polite and conversational as if I were reviewing a mundane quarterly projection. I asked about Ethan's upcoming orthodontic consultation. Madeline was, understandably, quite horrified to be receiving a phone call from a woman who had supposedly died of a neurological disease 5 years ago. I believe she is currently packing her bags. She mentioned something about changing the locks on the Providence house before the sun goes down. His two meticulously curated universes collided and vaporized in the exact same millisecond. He was no longer the tragic, resilient widower in Rhode Island, just as he was no longer the devoted, affluent patriarch in Connecticut. He was entirely exposed, a fraud stripped of his funding, his family, and his carefully constructed narrative. He did not yell. There was no theatrical outburst. The sheer magnitude of his defeat had completely paralyzed his vocal cords. He looked down at his own hands, resting on the mahogany table next to his untouched sea base, as if they belonged to a stranger. He looked incredibly small. The tailored Tom Ford shirt suddenly hung off his frame like a borrowed costume on a very tired actor. The Hamptons beach house, with its panoramic ocean views and expensive modern art, aggressively rejected him. "Your bags are already packed and sitting by the front door," I informed him, gesturing vaguely toward the expansive entryway. "The Range Rover is registered under the LLC, which, as of 3 p.m. today, I legally control. You will have to call an Uber. I suggest you do it quickly. The rates out of Amagansett are astronomical this time of night, and considering your frozen accounts, your available credit limit is likely dwindling by the minute." He stood up slowly, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He didn't look at Sarah, who was leaning against her sister, finally drawing deep, full breaths into her lungs for the first time in 3 years. He didn't look at Maya, who was staring at him with a mixture of profound disgust and pity.
And he certainly did not look at me.
He turned and walked down the long hallway, a hollow ghost haunting his own ruined life. We heard the heavy front door open, the crunch of crushed shell gravel beneath his leather loafers, and finally, the quiet, definitive click of the deadbolt securing the house behind him. The aftermath was profoundly peaceful. The divorce proceeded exactly as I had architected. Richard spent the next 2 years fighting a losing battle against an army of forensic accountants, living in a depressing, sparsely furnished studio apartment in a bleak industrial park. I never saw him in the courtroom. I let my attorneys dismantle the carcass of his empire while I focused entirely on the future. The irrevocable trust secured my daughter's financial independence, and Sarah, unburdened from her father's radioactive secret, finally thrived, graduating at the top of her law school class.
I didn't yell.
I didn't degrade myself with emotional vengeance. I simply let the system execute the man who thought he could outsmart it. Some men look out at their manicured lawns and corner offices and genuinely believe they can rule the world. We women do not need to fight them for the throne. We merely calculate the structural integrity of their kingdom, find the weakest pillar, and quietly pull the ground out from under them. If this reminded you of a battle you had to win in silence, share this video, subscribe, and drop a comment below. I'll see you in the next story.